The thunder cracked overhead as Lillian Montgomery stared hopelessly at the wagon axle buried deep in the mud, her trembling hands clutching the soaked fabric of her skirt. It was May 1875, and the spring rains had transformed the road to Genoa, Nevada, into a treacherous mire that had finally claimed her last hope of reaching town before nightfall. Rain pelted her bonnet as she surveyed the damage, cursing her decision to leave the safety of St. Louis for the uncertainty of the West. The wooden wheel had splintered where it met the axle, the wagon listing dangerously to one side with her worldly possessions threatening to spill into the mud. Her chestnut mare nickered nervously, sensing her mistress's distress. "Easy, Penny," Lillian soothed, though her voice cracked with barely contained panic. At 22, she had faced her share of hardships since her parents' passing, but standing alone on this desolate road with storm clouds gathering felt like the final cruelty of fate. She heard the horse before she saw it, the rhythmic splash of hooves through mud, approaching from the direction of town. Lillian stepped back from her wagon, suddenly aware of her vulnerability. Tales of bandits and unsavory characters preyed on her mind as she squinted through the rain to make out the rider. The silhouette that emerged from the gray curtain of rain was tall and broad-shouldered, the brim of his hat pulled low against the downpour. As he drew closer, Lillian could see that he sat easy in the saddle, his duster darkened with rain. "Looks like you've got yourself in quite a fix, madam," the stranger called, his voice deep but not unkind. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. Lillian straightened her spine. The axle snapped. "I'm afraid I'm quite stranded." He approached, and she could see him clearly now, tall and weathered, with eyes the color of a summer storm and a strong jawline softened by several days' worth of beard. He couldn't have been more than 30, though life in the West had a way of aging a man beyond his years. "Garrett Kincaid," he introduced himself, tipping his hat. "Ranch foreman at the Lazy K, just outside Genoa." "Lillian Montgomery," she replied, offering a gloved hand that was promptly enveloped in his much larger one. "I was headed to town. My uncle owns the mercantile there." "Edmund Montgomery?" Garrett asked, his expression shifting to one of recognition. "Good man. Been worried about you, he has." Mentioned his niece was coming from back east. Relief washed over Lillian. "Yes, that's my uncle. I'm later than expected. The journey west was more challenging than anticipated." Garrett circled the wagon, his experienced eyes assessing the damage. He crouched beside the broken axle, his fingers probing the splintered wood. "This won't be a quick fix, Miss Montgomery, not in this weather." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Night's coming, and these spring storms can turn mean. Town's still 4 miles off. What do you suggest?" Lillian asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. Garrett stood, wiping mud from his hands. "I can take you to the ranch. It's closer than town, just over that ridge. We've got a bunkhouse where you can stay dry, and I can send some of the boys back for your things once the rain lets up." Lillian hesitated, weighing her limited options. Propriety demanded caution around strange men, but the worsening storm made her decision for her. "I would be most grateful, Mr. Kincaid." A small smile touched his lips. "Most folks just call me Garrett." He moved to her horse, checking the harness. "Let's get her free from this mess, and you can ride double with me." Working methodically, he unhitched Penny from the wagon and secured her reins to his saddle. Then he turned to Lillian, who stood awkwardly by the wagon, reluctant to abandon her possessions. "Don't worry," he said, reading her thoughts. "We'll get your things tomorrow. Nothing out here but coyotes and jackrabbits tonight, and neither has much use for ladies' dresses." His gentle teasing brought a reluctant smile to her lips. "I suppose you're right." Garrett moved to his horse, a magnificent buckskin stallion that stood calmly despite the weather. "This is Thunder. He's strong enough to carry us both." With surprising gentleness, he helped Lillian mount, then swung up behind her. She stiffened momentarily at the unfamiliar proximity to a man she'd just met, but the security of his arm around her waist as he took the reins was oddly comforting. "Hold on," he advised, and then they were moving, leaving the stranded wagon behind as they rode toward the promise of shelter. The rain eased somewhat as they crested the ridge, revealing a sprawling ranch nestled in the valley below. Even through the gloom, Lillian could make out a large main house, several outbuildings and corrals where cattle huddled against the weather. "The Lazy K," Garrett announced with undisguised pride. 12,000 acres of the best grazing land in Nevada territory. "It's impressive," Lillian admitted, taking in the scale of the operation. "I didn't realize ranches could be so vast." "Out here, land's the one thing we've got plenty of," he replied, guiding his horse down the slope toward the buildings. "It's water and good help that's scarce." As they approached the ranch, dogs began to bark, and a figure emerged from the barn, lantern held high. "That you, Garrett?" a voice called. "It's me, Pete. Found a stranded traveler on the Carson Road. Miss Montgomery was headed to town when her wagon axle snapped in the mud." The man named Pete nodded, taking the reins of both horses as Garrett dismounted. "Storm's getting worse. Good thing you found her when you did." Garrett turned and reached up for Lillian, his hand spanning her waist as he lifted her effortlessly to the ground. For a moment, she was acutely aware of his strength and proximity, a strange flutter awakening in her chest. "Let's get you inside," he said, seemingly oblivious to her momentary discomfort. "Mrs. Abernathy keeps house for the ranch owner. She'll get you sorted with dry clothes and a hot meal." Lillian allowed herself to be led toward the main house, a substantial two-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Despite her predicament, she couldn't help but be impressed by the evident prosperity of the Lazy K. Mrs. Abernathy proved to be a plump, motherly woman who clucked over Lillian like a hen with a lost chick. Within an hour, Lillian found herself dressed in borrowed clothes, simple but clean, seated before a roaring fire with a bowl of hearty stew in her hands. "Mr. Kellogg, the ranch owner, is away on business in Sacramento," Mrs. Abernathy explained as she bustled around the kitchen. "But he'd want you made comfortable, dear. Any friend of Edmund Montgomery is welcome at the Lazy K." "I'm most grateful," Lillian said, savoring the warmth of both the fire and the food. "I didn't expect such kindness from strangers." "Strangers don't last long out here," Garrett commented, entering the kitchen with his hat in his hands, his dark hair still damp from the rain. "Neighbors help neighbors, or nobody survives." He'd cleaned up as well, exchanging his mud-spattered duster for a fresh shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. Lillian found herself noticing the strong line of his jaw, now visible without the shadow of his hat brim. "I've sent word to your uncle," he continued, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Abernathy. "Pete rode to town with the news that you're safe. Edmund will likely come out tomorrow, weather permitting." "Thank you," Lillian said sincerely. "I can't imagine what would have happened if you hadn't come along." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Just doing what anyone would do, Miss Montgomery." "Lillian, please," she corrected. "After riding through a storm together, I think we can dispense with formalities." His eyes met hers, something warm flickering in their depths. "Lillian, it is." Mrs. Abernathy cleared her throat, a knowing look on her face that made Lillian blush faintly. "I've prepared the blue room for you, dear. It's the warmest in the house, and you'll want a good night's rest after your ordeal." Later, As Lillian settled into the surprisingly comfortable bed in the blue room, she found her thoughts returning to Garrett Kincaid. There was something compelling about the ranch foreman, a quiet strength and dignity that seemed rare among men. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was slow in coming as she replayed their meeting in her mind, wondering what the morning would bring. The dawn arrived clear and bright, the storm having spent its fury during the night. Lillian woke to sunlight streaming through curtains and the distant sounds of ranch life already in full swing. Dressing quickly in her now dried traveling clothes, she made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Abernathy preparing breakfast. "Good morning, dear. Sleep well?" the housekeeper asked, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon onto the table. "Better than I expected," Lillian admitted, accepting the offered cup of coffee. "Has there been any word from my uncle?" "Not yet, but the roads will be muddy." "Mr. Kincaid rode out at first light with some of the men to retrieve your wagon. Said they'd bring it back here for repairs before taking it on to town." Lillian's heart gave an unexpected leap at the mention of Garrett. "He's very kind." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes twinkled. "He's a good man, our Mr. Kincaid. Been with the ranch for 5 years now, and a finer foreman Mr. Kellogg couldn't ask for." Curiosity prompted Lillian's next question. "Has he family nearby?" "No family that I know of," the older woman replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Keeps to himself mostly, though he's respected by every man on the payroll." She paused, studying Lillian with shrewd eyes. "He's not one for social calls in town either, if that's what you're wondering." Lillian felt her cheeks warm. "I wasn't, that is. I merely—" Mrs. Abernathy laughed kindly. "No need to explain, dear. It's natural to be curious about the man who rescued you." Before Lillian could respond, the sound of horses approaching drew their attention. Through the window, she saw Garrett riding in, followed by several ranch hands pulling her wagon. Her heart quickened inexplicably at the sight of him, tall and straight in the saddle, directing the men with easy authority. "Looks like they've managed to fix your axle well enough to move it," Mrs. Abernathy observed. "That's Garrett for you, resourceful as they come." Lillian moved to the door, stepping onto the porch as the men pulled the wagon into the yard. Garrett spotted her and dismounted, removing his hat as he approached. "Good morning," he greeted, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "We've got your wagon, though it'll need proper repairs before it's road-worthy again." "Thank you," Lillian said, genuinely moved by his efforts. "I don't know how to repay such kindness." He shrugged, a slight smile playing on his lips. "No repayment necessary. Your uncle's well respected in these parts. Besides, couldn't leave a lady stranded in the mud, now could I?" Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another rider, who Lillian recognized with relief as her Uncle Edmund. He was a stout man in his 50s, his familiar face lighting up at the sight of his niece. "Lillian, thank God you're safe," he called, dismounting with less grace than Garrett had shown. "When I got word you were stranded, I feared the worst." "I'm perfectly fine, Uncle," she assured him as he embraced her. "Mr. Kincaid came to my rescue." Edmund turned to Garrett, extending his hand. "I'm in your debt, Kincaid. My sister's daughter is all the family I have left." Garrett accepted the handshake. "Just happened to be in the right place. Your niece handled herself with remarkable composure." Something in his tone made Lillian look at him sharply, catching a glimpse of admiration in his eyes before he turned away to issue instructions to the ranch hands about the wagon. "Well, we should get you to town," Edmund said, reclaiming Lillian's attention. "Your room is all prepared and half the ladies of Genoa are eager to meet you." Lillian nodded, though she felt an unexpected reluctance to leave the Lazy K. "Of course. I just need to thank Mrs. Abernathy for her hospitality." As she turned to go back inside, Garrett called after her. "Miss Montgomery, She paused, looking back at him expectantly. "There's a social at the church next Saturday, first one since winter broke." He hesitated, an uncharacteristic uncertainty crossing his features. "If you've settled in by then, perhaps you'd allow me to escort you." The invitation surprised her, especially given Mrs. Abernathy's comment about his usual avoidance of social gatherings. Before she could overthink her response, Lillian found herself smiling. "I would like that very much, Mr. Kincaid." His answering smile transformed his weathered face, revealing a dimple in his right cheek she hadn't noticed before. "I'll call for you at 6 then." With her heart beating a little faster, Lillian nodded and returned to the house to gather her things, aware that her arrival in Genoa, Nevada, was already proving far more interesting than she had anticipated. The journey to town was mercifully uneventful, though Lillian found her thoughts repeatedly drifting back to the lazy K and its taciturn foreman. Uncle Edmund filled the time with stories of Genoa and its inhabitants, clearly delighted to have his niece with him at last. "It's not St. Louis," he cautioned as the small settlement came into view, "but there's good people here. Honest folk making a life on the frontier." Genoa was indeed modest compared to the city she'd left behind, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, the church steeple the tallest structure in sight. Yet there was something charming about its simplicity, the surrounding mountains providing a majestic backdrop to the frontier town. Edmund's store occupied a prime location at the center of town, with living quarters above. The rooms were small but comfortable, and Lillian was touched by the efforts her uncle had made to prepare for her arrival: fresh curtains at the windows, a bookshelf filled with volumes he thought she might enjoy, and a writing desk positioned to capture the morning light. "It's perfect, Uncle," she assured him, genuinely pleased with her new home. The following days passed in a flurry of introductions, as it seemed everyone in Genoa found reason to visit the mercantile and meet Edmund Montgomery's niece from back east. Lillian quickly discovered that her uncle was indeed well respected, and by extension, she was welcomed warmly into the small community. Mrs. Hargrove, the minister's wife, wasted no time in recruiting Lillian for the church social committee. "We need young blood," she declared, "and someone with Eastern refinement to elevate our humble gatherings." Meanwhile, Lillian found satisfaction in helping at the store, her education proving useful in keeping the books and corresponding with suppliers. The work was engaging enough that she managed to push thoughts of Garrett Kincaid to the periphery of her mind, at least during daylight hours. By the time Saturday arrived, however, she found herself unusually nervous as she prepared for the social. She had brought few fancy clothes west, but her best blue dress with its modest lace collar would have to suffice. As she pinned her honey-brown hair into a simple but elegant knot, she wondered what had possessed Garrett to extend the invitation in the first place. "You look lovely," Edmund commented as she descended the stairs at 5:45. "Blue always was your color." "Thank you, Uncle." She smoothed her skirt self-consciously. "Do you think it's appropriate for a church social?" "More than appropriate." He regarded her with fatherly affection. "Kincaid won't know what hit him." Lillian blushed. "Uncle, it's merely a neighborly outing." Edmund's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Of course it is. And I should warn you, Garrett Kincaid escorting a lady to a social event is about as rare as snow in July around these parts." "You've made quite an impression." Before Lillian could formulate a response, a knock sounded at the door. Her heart skipped as Edmund went to answer it, revealing Garrett standing on the threshold. He was transformed from the mud-spattered cowboy she'd met on the road, clean-shaven, his dark hair neatly combed, wearing a pressed shirt and string tie with his best denims. "Evening, Mr. Montgomery," he greeted, Then his eyes found Lillian, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Miss Montgomery." "Mr. Kincaid," she returned, pleased that her voice remained steady. "You kids enjoy yourselves," Edmund said with a barely concealed grin. "Don't keep her out too late, Kincaid. We open early on Sundays for the church crowd." "Yes, sir," Garrett replied respectfully, offering his arm to Lillian. "Shall we?" The touch of his arm beneath her hand sent a pleasant warmth through Lillian as they stepped onto the boardwalk. The spring evening was mild, the setting sun painting the mountains gold and rose. Several other couples and families were making their way toward the church, where lanterns already glowed in welcome. "You look beautiful," Garrett said quietly, his eyes fixed ahead. "That color suits you." "Thank you," Lillian replied, oddly touched by his simple compliment. "You clean up rather well yourself." He glanced down at her, a half-smile playing on his lips. "Don't get much occasion for it, truth be told. So I've heard. Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you're not one for social gatherings. Did she now?" He chuckled, the sound rich and warm. "Mrs. Abernathy needs to mind her own business." "Then why the church social?" Lillian couldn't resist asking. Garrett was silent for a moment, then said simply, "Seemed like a good opportunity to see you again." The honesty of his answer left Lillian momentarily speechless, a pleasant flutter in her stomach. Before she could respond, they arrived at the church, where the social was already in full swing. Tables laden with food lined one wall of the meeting hall, while a small group of local musicians played lively tunes in the corner. Lanterns and spring flowers decorated the room, transforming the simple space into something festive. "Lillian, dear." Mrs. Hargrove descended upon them immediately. "So glad you could come. And Mr. Kincaid, what a pleasant surprise." "Madam," Garrett acknowledged with a respectful nod. "You must introduce your gentleman friend to everyone," Mrs. Hargrove insisted, already pulling Lillian toward a group of townsfolk. Lillian threw an apologetic glance over her shoulder at Garrett, who followed with resigned amusement. The next hour passed in a whirl of introductions and conversation, with Lillian discovering that Garrett, despite his reputation for solitude, was well respected throughout the community. Several of the older ranchers greeted him with particular deference, and Lillian noted how the younger men seemed to straighten in his presence. "Your Mr. Kincaid is something of a local legend," whispered Sarah Jensen, the blacksmith's daughter, when they had a moment alone. "They say he once tracked a gang of cattle rustlers for 3 days straight and brought them all in single-handedly." "He's not my Mr. Kincaid," Lillian protested, though the possessive phrasing sent an unexpected thrill through her. Sarah merely smiled knowingly. "He's never brought anyone to a social before. Not once in all the years he's been foreman at the Lazy K." Before Lillian could process this information, the music shifted to a waltz and Garrett appeared at her side. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his storm-gray eyes intent on hers. Dancing had always been Lillian's joy in St. Louis, but she hadn't expected such an opportunity in Genoa. "You dance, Mr. Kincaid, poorly," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile, "but I'd like to try if you're willing." She placed her hand in his outstretched one. "I'd be delighted." Garrett led her to the center of the room, where several couples were already moving to the music. His hand at her waist was firm but gentle, and despite his modest assessment of his abilities, he guided her with surprising grace. "You dance better than you let on," Lillian observed as they circled the floor. "Had some practice in my younger days," he replied, "before I came west." "And where was that?" A shadow crossed his features. "Pennsylvania originally, left after the war." The brief mention of his past intrigued Lillian. "You fought in the war," he nodded, his expression closing slightly. "Union cavalry, not something I care to dwell on. Understanding his reluctance, Lillian changed the subject. "How did you come to be at the Lazy K?" The tension in his shoulders eased. "Drifted west after the war, worked cattle drives in Texas, then gradually made my way up to Nevada. Mr. Kellogg took a chance on me 5 years ago when he needed a new foreman. Been there ever since. You must be good at what you do." "I know cattle," he said simply. "And men. Out here, that's most of what you need." The music drew to a close, but neither moved to separate immediately. Lillian was acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the faint scent of soap and leather that clung to him. "Would you like some air?" he asked, seeming to sense her sudden discomfort. "It's getting warm in here." Lillian nodded, and he led her toward the side door that opened onto the small church garden. The night had fully descended, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. The sounds of the social faded as they walked among the newly budding rose bushes, the air cool and sweet with spring. "It's beautiful here," Lillian said softly, gazing up at the vast canopy of stars. "Different from the east. Everything seems bigger somehow." "That's the West for you," Garrett agreed, his voice equally quiet. "Big skies, big land, big possibilities." "Is that why you stayed? The possibilities?" He considered her question thoughtfully. "Partly. After the war, the East felt confining. Too many ghosts. Out here, a man can breathe. Can make something of himself without the weight of the past pressing down." "And have you made something of yourself?" Garrett turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I've made a life I'm not ashamed of. It's enough for most days." The simple honesty of his answer moved Lillian deeply. In the week since their first meeting, she had begun to see beyond the taciturn exterior to the man beneath, honorable, intelligent, carrying wounds he never spoke of, but which had shaped him nonetheless. "I'm glad the storm brought us together, Mr. Kincaid," she said impulsively, "even if it did cost me a wagon axle." His smile in the darkness was slow and genuine. "Garrett," he reminded her. "And I'm beginning to think that broken axle might be the luckiest thing that's happened to me in a long while." The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken possibility. For an instant, Lillian thought he might kiss her, and the realization that she wanted him to came as a startling revelation. Instead, he offered his arm once more. "We should get back before your uncle sends out a search party." The remainder of the evening passed pleasantly, with more dancing, conversation, and laughter. Lillian found herself watching Garrett when he wasn't looking, noticing the rare but transformative quality of his smile, the respectful way he interacted with everyone regardless of their station, the quiet competence he exuded without arrogance. When the social drew to a close, Garrett walked her home beneath the star-strewn sky. They talked easily now, the initial awkwardness between them dissolved by the shared evening. At her uncle's door they paused. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Lillian said, suddenly shy again. "The pleasure was mine." Garrett hesitated, then added, "The spring cattle drive starts next week. I'll be gone for about 10 days, taking a herd to the railhead in Reno." "Oh," Lillian tried to hide her disappointment. "Of course, that's part of your duties as foreman, when I return." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Would you consider allowing me to call on you properly?" Her heart leapt at his formal request. "I would like that very much." The smile that illuminated his features was worth the admission. "Good night then, Lillian. Until I return." "Good night, Garrett. Be safe on your journey." He tipped his hat and turned to go, but not before Lillian caught the look of quiet happiness in his eyes, a look she suspected was mirrored in her own. The days of Garrett's absence stretched longer than Lillian had anticipated. She threw herself into work at the mercantile, grateful for the distraction as she adjusted to life in Genoa. The town was growing on her, the friendly faces, the majestic surroundings, the sense of community so different from the anonymous crowds of St. Louis. Uncle Edmund watched her with knowing eyes but said little about Garrett directly, though he occasionally mentioned news from the Lazy K when customers brought word. The cattle drive was proceeding well. The spring calving had been successful, and Mr. Kellogg had returned from Sacramento with plans to expand the ranch's holdings. Lillian absorbed these details hungrily, building a more complete picture of the world Garrett inhabited. In quiet moments, she found herself remembering the feel of his hand at her waist during their dance, the intensity of his gray eyes when he'd asked to court her properly. 10 days stretched to 12, then 14. Lillian tried not to worry, reminding herself that cattle drives were unpredictable endeavors, subject to weather and 1,000 other variables. Still, when the bell above the mercantile door jingled late one afternoon and she looked up to find Garrett standing there, hat in hand, the relief that flooded through her was overwhelming. "You're back," she said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. He looked tired but satisfied, his skin further bronzed by 2 weeks under the open sky. "Got in this morning. Thought I'd come see if your uncle needs any supplies for the store." Edmund emerged from the storeroom, a knowing grin splitting his face. "Kincaid, heard the drive went well." "Yes, sir. Got a good price at the railhead, too." "Excellent, excellent. Say, Lillian, why don't you take your break now? I'm sure Mr. Kincaid wouldn't mind some coffee at the hotel restaurant." Lillian shot her uncle a look that he blithely ignored, but Garrett's eyes brightened at the suggestion. "I would appreciate the company if you're available," he said. Minutes later, they were seated at a corner table in the hotel's small restaurant, the only patrons at this odd hour between lunch and dinner. Lillian found herself studying Garrett's face, noting the new lines of fatigue around his eyes, the healing cut on his jawline that hadn't been there before. "The drive was difficult," she asked, pouring coffee for them both. "Had some trouble crossing the Truckee," he admitted. "Lost 2 men and a dozen head when the river rose unexpectedly. Could have been worse." "I'm sorry," Lillian said softly. "Were the men friends?" "No, new hands hired for the drive. Still, it's never easy losing men under your command." His expression darkened momentarily, and Lillian suspected he was remembering other losses, older griefs from the war he rarely mentioned. Instinctively, she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I'm glad you returned safely." He glanced down at their joined hands, then back to her face, something warming in his eyes. "I had reason to hurry back." The simple statement sent heat flooding to Lillian's cheeks. She withdrew her hand, suddenly self-conscious about their public location. "Genoa was quiet in your absence. Mrs. Hargrove has been organizing a Founders' Day celebration for next month. She's recruited half the town already." "Including you?" he asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm apparently in charge of decorations for the dance," she confirmed. "Heaven knows why when I've been here barely a month." "Because you bring fresh ideas," Garrett suggested, "and because you've already made an impression on the town." "As have you," she countered. "Though in your case, it seems to involve tales of heroic pursuits of cattle rustlers," he groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Who's been telling stories?" Sarah Jensen mentioned something at the social. Lillian couldn't resist teasing him. "Is it true you tracked them for 3 days alone?" 2 days, he corrected reluctantly. "And I had my dog with me, so I wasn't exactly alone. Still impressive." "Just doing my job," he shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Speaking of which, I should let you get back to yours. Your uncle's been generous with your time." As they walked back to the mercantile, Garrett cleared his throat. "I was wondering if you might be free on Sunday afternoon. For a ride, perhaps. I could show you some of the country around Genoa. Lillian's heart quickened at the prospect of spending time alone with him. I'd like that very much. I'll come by after church then, if that suits. They parted at the mercantile door with the promise of Sunday hanging between them, a bright spot of anticipation in Lillian's week. Sunday dawned clear and perfect, the kind of spring day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Lillian wore her riding habit to church, earning knowing looks from several of the town's matrons who had clearly noticed Garrett Kincaid's interest in the new arrival. True to his word, Garrett appeared after the service with 2 horses, his own buckskin and a gentle mare for Lillian. "She's called Daisy," he explained as he helped Lillian mount. "Steady as they come. She'll give you no trouble." Lillian settled into the saddle, adjusting her skirts. She was a competent rider, having learned as a child in St. Louis, but it had been some time since she'd ridden regularly. "Where are we going?" she asked as they set off at an easy pace. "Thought I'd show you my favorite spot," Garrett replied. "It's about an hour's ride. The view is worth it." They rode west from town, following a winding trail that gradually climbed into the foothills. Garrett proved to be a knowledgeable guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history. Lillian found herself relaxing in his company, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. "How are you finding Genoa?" he asked as they paused to let the horses drink from a clear stream. "I like it more than I expected," Lillian admitted. "It's nothing like St. Louis, of course, but there's something honest about it. The people have been welcoming. And your uncle, you're happy working with him." "Very much so. He's been alone too long, I think. We're good for each other." She hesitated, then added, "After my parents died, I wasn't sure where I belonged anymore. Coming west was something of a desperate gamble." Garrett nodded in understanding. "Sometimes the best decisions come from desperation. I never planned to stay in Nevada, but here I am, 5 years later with no desire to leave." "What keeps you here? Besides the job, I mean." He looked around at the sweeping landscape, the mountains rising majestically in the distance, the valley spreading below. "This land gets under your skin. There's a freedom here I haven't found elsewhere." His eyes met hers. "And now, perhaps, there are other reasons to stay." The simple statement sent warmth spreading through Lillian's chest. Before she could respond, he was mounting again, gesturing for her to follow. "We're almost there." 20 minutes later, they crested a ridge and Lillian gasped at the vista that opened before them. The entire Carson Valley spread out below, a patchwork of greens and golds, with the Carson River winding like a silver ribbon through its center. In the distance, the Sierra Nevada mountains formed a jagged barrier against the western sky, their peaks still snow-capped despite the spring warmth. "It's magnificent," she breathed, dismounting to better appreciate the view. Garrett tied the horses to a nearby pine and joined her at the edge of the ridge. "I come here to think sometimes. Helps put things in perspective." They stood in companionable silence for a while, absorbing the grandeur of the landscape. Lillian was acutely aware of Garrett beside her, his solid presence somehow both comforting and exhilarating. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said finally, "for sharing this with me." He turned to look at her, his expression open and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. "Lillian, I'm not a man of many words, but I want you to know that meeting you, it's changed something for me, woken something I thought was long dead." The raw honesty in his voice touched her deeply. "I feel it too," she admitted. "This connection between us, it's unexpected but undeniable." Garrett stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "May I kiss you, Lillian?" Her heart hammered in her chest as she nodded, unable to form words. Gently, he cupped her face in his calloused hands and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was tender, questioning at first, then deepening as she responded. Lillian felt herself melting against him, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the night of the social," he confessed. "I'm glad you finally did," Lillian replied, a smile curving her lips. They spent the remainder of the afternoon on the ridge, sharing a simple picnic that Mrs. Abernathy had packed for them, talking and laughing with the easy comfort of people discovering the joy of each other's company. Lillian learned more about Garrett's past, his childhood on a small Pennsylvania farm, his service in the Union Cavalry, his restless wandering after the war until he found his place at the Lazy K. In turn, she told him about her life in St. Louis, her parents' deaths from influenza 3 years earlier, her struggle to maintain independence before finally accepting her uncle's invitation to come west. "I was afraid I was admitting defeat by coming here," she confessed, "that I was too weak to make my own way." "There's no weakness in accepting help," Garrett said, his eyes serious. "The West wasn't settled by lone wolves, whatever the dime novels might say. It takes community to survive out here." As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, they reluctantly mounted up for the return journey. The ride back to town was quiet but comfortable, both lost in their own thoughts about the day's revelations. At her uncle's door, Garrett helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "I have to go to Carson City tomorrow on ranch business," he said. "I'll be gone for 3 days. But when I return, I'd like to call on you again." "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," Lillian replied honestly. He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Good night, Lillian." "Good night, Garrett." She watched him ride away, her heart fuller than it had been in years. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that brought Lillian increasing happiness. Garrett called on her whenever his duties at the Lazy K permitted, sometimes for planned outings, a picnic by the river, another ride into the hills, and sometimes just to spend an evening on her uncle's porch, talking as the stars emerged overhead. Edmund observed their growing attachment with obvious approval, often finding reasons to make himself scarce when Garrett visited. "The boy's solid as they come," he told Lillian one evening after Garrett had left. "Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." The town of Genoa, too, had noticed the blossoming relationship. Mrs. Hargrove made a point of seating them together at church functions, while Sarah Jensen teased Lillian good-naturedly about taming the wild foreman. For her part, Lillian found herself falling deeper in love with both Garrett and the western landscape he'd introduced her to. She discovered a strength in herself she hadn't known existed, an ability to adapt to this new life and find joy in its challenges. As spring gave way to summer, the Founders' Day celebration approached. The entire town buzzed with preparations, and Lillian threw herself into her duties on the decoration committee. The day before the event found her in the town hall, directing the hanging of bunting and arranging flowers with several other women. "You've done wonders, dear," Mrs. Hargrove approved, surveying the transformed space. "No one would guess you've only been in Genoa a few months." "It feels longer," Lillian admitted, adjusting a floral arrangement, "in the best possible way." Mrs. Hargrove patted her hand knowingly. "When the heart finds its home, time has a way of losing meaning. Speaking of which, here comes your young man." Lillian turned to see Garrett entering the hall, his tall figure commanding attention without effort. Her heart leapt at the sight of him, as it invariably did. "Ladies," he greeted, nodding respectfully to Mrs. Hargrove and the others. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Mr. Kincaid," Mrs. Hargrove assured him. "In fact, we could use a tall gentleman's assistance with the high bunting. Lillian, why don't you show him what needs doing? Grateful for the excuse to speak privately, Lillian led Garrett to the far end of the hall. "I didn't expect to see you today," she said. "I thought you'd be busy with ranch preparations for tomorrow." "Finished early," he replied, his eyes taking in her appearance appreciatively. She'd pinned her hair up loosely for the work, and tendrils had escaped to frame her face. "Wanted to see you." The simple admission still had the power to warm her from within. "I'm glad. Though I'm afraid Mrs. Hargrove wasn't joking about the bunting," Garrett chuckled, removing his hat and jacket. "Happy to help, though I did have an ulterior motive for coming to town." "Oh." Lillian handed him a length of red, white, and blue fabric. He accepted it, then caught her hand before she could withdraw it. "I wanted to ask if you'd save me the first dance tomorrow night, and the last, and as many as possible in between." She smiled up at him, squeezing his fingers. "I believe that can be arranged, Mr. Kincaid." They worked side by side for the next hour, their conversation easy and punctuated with shared glances that spoke volumes about their deepening feelings. When the decorations were finally complete, Garrett walked Lillian back to the mercantile. "I should get back to the ranch," he said reluctantly. "Mr. Kellogg wants everything in order before he leaves for the celebration tomorrow." "Will I see you before the dance? I'll be here for the midday festivities," he promised. "Wouldn't miss seeing you judge the pie contest." She laughed, having been roped into that duty by Mrs. Hargrove despite her protests that she knew little about Western-style baking. "I'll try to save you a slice of the winner." Garrett's expression grew suddenly serious. "Lillian, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about." "Something important. But not now, tomorrow after the dance, perhaps?" Curiosity piqued, she nodded. "Of course. Is everything all right?" "More than all right," he assured her, his eyes warm with an emotion that made her breath catch. "Until tomorrow, then." He bent and brushed his lips against hers. A brief but tender kiss that left Lillian feeling as though she were floating as she watched him stride away. The Founders' Day celebration dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for the outdoor festivities planned before the evening dance. Genoa's main street was festooned with flags and bunting, and tables had been set up in the town square for the community meal at midday. Lillian wore her second-best dress for the daytime events, a yellow muslin that brought out the gold highlights in her hair. As promised, Garrett appeared shortly before noon, looking handsome in clean denims and a pressed shirt, his dark hair still damp from washing. "You look beautiful," he greeted her, taking in the yellow dress with obvious appreciation. "Thank you," she replied, smoothing her skirt self-consciously. "You're quite dashing yourself." They spent the afternoon moving through the various activities together, watching the horse races, applauding the children's recitations, laughing at the three-legged race in which Uncle Edmund partnered with the blacksmith to surprising success. Lillian did indeed judge the pie contest, awarding first prize to Mrs. Jensen's huckleberry creation with what she hoped was appropriate gravity. "You're a natural," Garrett murmured as they watched the town band set up for an afternoon concert. "Everyone here has accepted you as one of their own." "It's a good community," Lillian acknowledged. "I never expected to feel so at home here." His eyes held hers meaningfully. "And do you feel at home in Genoa?" "I do," she answered honestly. "More than I ever did in St. Louis after my parents died." Something like satisfaction crossed his features. "I'm glad to hear it." As the afternoon waned, they parted briefly so that Lillian could return to her uncle's to change for the evening dance. She took special care with her appearance, selecting her best dress, a deep blue silk that she'd brought from St. Louis, saved for special occasions. As she arranged her hair, pinning it up with her mother's pearl combs, she found herself wondering about Garrett's mysterious, important conversation. Could he be planning to propose? The thought sent a flutter of excitement through her. They had known each other only a few months, but in that time, their connection had deepened into something profound. Lillian knew with certainty that she loved him, his strength and gentleness, his quiet dignity, his unwavering integrity. When she descended the stairs, Uncle Edmund whistled in appreciation. "You'll be breaking hearts tonight, my girl," she laughed, twirling for his inspection. "Just one heart I'm interested in, Uncle, and I rather hope not to break it." "Kincaid's a lucky man," Edmund said softly, "and I think he knows it." Garrett arrived promptly at 7 to escort them to the dance. His eyes widened appreciatively at the sight of Lillian in her finery. "You're a vision," he said simply, the admiration in his gaze making her blush. The town hall had been transformed by the decorations into a festive ballroom, lanterns casting a warm glow over the assembled townsfolk. The band struck up a lively tune as they entered, and without preamble, Garrett led Lillian onto the dance floor. "I've been looking forward to this all day," he confessed as they joined the other couples. "As have I," Lillian replied, enjoying the solid warmth of his hand at her waist, the confidence with which he guided her through the steps. They danced the first 3 dances together before propriety demanded that Lillian accept other partners. She danced with Uncle Edmund, with the mayor, with Mr. Jensen the blacksmith, all the while aware of Garrett's eyes following her movements from across the room. During a brief respite, Sarah Jensen cornered Lillian by the refreshment table. "He hasn't taken his eyes off you all night," she observed, nodding toward Garrett, who was engaged in conversation with several ranchers but indeed glancing their way. "Half the unmarried women in the county have set their caps for Garrett Kincaid over the years, but he never gave any of them a second look." "Perhaps he wasn't ready before," Lillian suggested, trying to hide her pleasure at Sarah's observation. "Or perhaps he was waiting for the right woman to come along," Sarah replied with a knowing smile. "One who could appreciate a man of substance rather than just a handsome face and steady job." Before Lillian could respond, Garrett appeared at her side, having extracted himself from his conversation. "May I claim another dance?" he asked, his eyes warm with promise. As they rejoined the dancers, Lillian was acutely aware of the watching eyes of the community, the approving glances from older couples, the speculation in the gazes of the unmarried. It should have made her uncomfortable, this public scrutiny, but instead she felt a sense of rightness, of belonging to this place and this moment. "You're quiet," Garrett observed as they circled the floor. "Everything all right, perfect," she assured him. "I was just thinking how fortunate I am to be here with you in this town that already feels like home." His hold on her tightened slightly. "I've been thinking the same." He hesitated, then added, "That matter I wanted to discuss with you, would you walk with me after this dance? There's a bench in the churchyard where we could talk privately." Anticipation fluttered in Lillian's chest. "Of course." When the music ended, they slipped out of the hall and into the cool evening air. The churchyard was deserted, the bench Garrett had mentioned situated beneath a large oak tree, far enough from the town hall that the music and laughter were muted. They sat side by side, Garrett taking her hand in his. For a moment, he seemed to struggle for words, uncharacteristically nervous. "Lillian, I'm not a man who finds it easy to speak of feelings," he began, "but these past months with you have been the happiest of my life." Her heart quickened at his words. "For me as well, Garrett. When I found you that day, with your wagon axle snapped in the mud, I had no idea how completely you would change my life." His gray eyes were intent on hers in the moonlight. "I'd resigned myself to solitude, convinced that the war had taken whatever capacity for tenderness I might have once possessed. And then there you were, rain-soaked and frustrated, but still with more spirit and determination than most men I've known. Lillian squeezed his hand, touched by his admission. I was terrified that day alone in a strange land, everything I owned about to be ruined by the storm. You were my salvation. No, he said firmly, you are mine. You've brought light back into my life, Lillian. Reminded me that there's more to living than just surviving. He shifted, releasing her hand to reach into his pocket. I spoke with your uncle last week, asked for his blessing. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, but out here, life teaches you not to waste time when you find something precious. Opening the box, he revealed a delicate gold ring with a small but perfect diamond. Lillian Montgomery, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Joy welled up in Lillian's chest, so intense it momentarily robbed her of speech. Yes, she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Garrett, I will marry you. His face transformed with happiness as he slid the ring onto her finger. I love you, Lillian, more than I ever thought possible. And I love you, she replied as he gathered her into his arms. Their kiss was tender at first, then deepening with the promise of their future together. When they finally parted, Garrett kept his arms around her, reluctant to break contact. I should warn you, he said, a hint of humor in his voice. Mrs. Abernathy is likely to take over all wedding preparations the moment she hears the news. Lillian laughed, resting her head against his chest. When shall we tell everyone? Tonight, if you're willing. No sense in waiting. His expression grew more serious. There's something else I should tell you. Mr. Kellogg has offered to sell me a parcel of land at the eastern edge of the Lazy K. 200 acres with water rights and good grazing. I've been saving for years, and with a loan from the bank I can manage it. Your own ranch, Lillian said, understanding the significance of such an opportunity in the West. He nodded. It would be a modest start, nothing like the Lazy K. But it would be ours. Something we could build together if you're willing to take on the challenge of a rancher's wife. I can think of nothing I'd rather do, she assured him, meaning every word. The prospect of creating a home with this man, of building something lasting in this wild, beautiful country, filled her with anticipation rather than trepidation. Hand in hand, they returned to the town hall, where the dance was still in full swing. Uncle Edmund spotted them immediately, his eyes going to the ring on Lillian's finger. With a broad smile, he crossed the room to embrace them both. It's official, then? He asked, though the answer was evident in their radiant expressions. It is, Garrett confirmed. She's agreed to make me the happiest man in Nevada territory. Word spread quickly through the hall, and soon they were surrounded by well-wishers. Mrs. Hargrove was already discussing potential wedding dates, while Mr. Jensen offered to craft special horseshoes for good luck. Sarah hugged Lillian tightly, whispering, I knew it from the moment I saw you two at the social. Later, as they danced the final waltz of the evening, Lillian looked up at her fiancé with wonder. Did you ever imagine, when you found me stranded on that muddy road, that we'd end up here? Garrett's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled down at her. No, but I think I started hoping for it the moment you looked at me with those determined brown eyes and refused to be defeated by a broken wagon axle. 6 weeks later, on a perfect summer morning, Lillian Montgomery became Lillian Kincaid in the white clapboard church of Genoa. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which spilled from the church into the town square, where tables groaned with food contributed by every household. Lillian wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Mrs. Hargrove and the sewing circle ladies. Garrett, unrecognizable in his new suit, waited for her at the altar with an expression of such naked adoration that several of the town matrons dabbed at their eyes before the ceremony even began. Uncle Edmund gave her away with proud tears in his eyes, and Mrs. Abernathy sat in the front pew, beaming like a surrogate mother. The vows were simple but heartfelt, the kiss that sealed them causing a spontaneous outbreak of applause that made Lillian blush. The reception lasted well into the evening, with dancing and feasting and toasts to the new couple's happiness. As the celebration wound down, Garrett led his bride to where their horses waited, decorated with flowers and ribbons for the occasion. "Ready to see our new home, Mrs. Kincaid?" he asked, helping her mount despite the voluminous skirts of her wedding dress. "More than ready," she assured him, her heart full to bursting with love for this man and the life they were about to begin. They rode away from town amid a shower of rice and good wishes, heading east toward the land that was now theirs. The two-room cabin Garrett had been building with the help of the Lazy K ranch hands came into view as they crested a small rise, its new pine boards golden in the setting sun. It was simple but sturdy, with windows that looked out over rolling grassland to the mountains beyond. A small barn stood nearby, and a vegetable garden had been started, Mrs. Abernathy's contribution to their new beginning. "It's not much," Garrett said as he helped Lillian dismount. "Not compared to what you left behind in St. Louis." She turned to face him, her eyes shining with love and certainty. "It's everything, Garrett. It's the beginning of our story." He kissed her then, beneath the vast Nevada sky that had brought them together, both knowing that the broken wagon axle that had stranded Lillian in the mud that stormy day had been the first step on a path neither could have imagined, but both would forever be grateful for. 10 years later, Lillian stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Garrett taught their 7-year-old son, James, how to properly rope a calf. Their 5-year-old daughter, Emma, sat on the bottom step, solemnly braiding wildflowers into a chain, while 3-year-old Thomas toddled after the ranch dog with determined steps. The Kincaid Ranch had prospered beyond their early hopes. What had begun as 200 acres, and a modest herd had grown to nearly 1,000 acres, and one of the finest breeding operations in the territory. The 2-room cabin had expanded to a comfortable home with room for their growing family, though Lillian had insisted on maintaining the simple charm of those early days. Uncle Edmund visited often from town, though his health had begun to fail in recent years. The mercantile was now managed by a young couple from California, with Edmund keeping the books and serving as a mentor. He doted on his grand-nieces and nephews, always arriving with pockets full of sweets and stories to share. Garrett finished his lesson and sent James to practice on the wooden calf they'd built for that purpose. Seeing Lillian on the porch, he walked toward her, his stride still vigorous despite the decade that had passed. A few strands of silver now threaded through his dark hair, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but to Lillian, he was more handsome than ever. "How are my girls?" he asked, including Emma in his glance as he climbed the steps. "Waiting for you," Lillian replied with a smile, accepting his brief kiss. "Emma's made you a crown of flowers." Their daughter held up her creation proudly. "It's for being the best papa," she explained seriously. Garrett crouched to her level, allowing her to place the somewhat lopsided crown on his head. "Thank you, Princess. It's beautiful." Thomas abandoned the dog to toddle toward his father, arms outstretched. "Up, Papa, up," scooping the boy into his arms, Garrett rejoined Lillian. "Letter came from Carson City," he mentioned. "Statehood's looking more likely by the day. Nevada might finally get its star on the flag before year's end." "That would be something," Lillian mused, "to go from territory to state in our time here." A lot's changed in 10 years, Garrett agreed, his free arm slipping around her waist. Not just Nevada. She leaned into him, watching James successfully rope his wooden target, his whoop of triumph carrying across the yard. Do you ever think about that day? When you found me stranded in the mud? Only every day, he replied, his voice warm with affection. Best detour I ever took. Lillian turned her face up to his, still finding the same wonder in his eyes that had been there on their wedding day. I was so frightened then, so unsure of my place in the world. I never imagined that broken axle would lead to all this, to you, to our children, to this life we've built. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best destinations, Garrett said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I thank God every day for that thunderstorm and that muddy road. As do I, Lillian agreed, thinking of how far they'd come from that rain-soaked first meeting. The journey hadn't always been easy drought years, difficult births, the challenges of carving a successful ranch from the wilderness, but they had faced each obstacle together, their love deepening with every trial overcome. As the sun began to set over their land, painting the mountains gold and purple, their children gathered around them on the porch. James proudly recounted his roping success. Emma distributed flower crowns to everyone, and Thomas contentedly dozed in his father's arms. Lillian gazed at her family, her heart full to overflowing with gratitude. The wagon axle that had snapped in the mud that stormy day had seemed like disaster at the time, but it had led her not just out of the storm, but into the arms of the man who would become her husband, her partner, her home. I love you, Garrett Kincaid, she said softly as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the Nevada sky. His arm tightened around her shoulders, his voice equally soft as he replied, And I love you, Lillian Kincaid. Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come. In the years that followed, their ranch continued to flourish, their family to grow. They weathered the inevitable storms of life together, both literal and figurative, their bond only strengthening with time. And though Nevada changed around them, becoming a state and gradually more settled as the century progressed, the foundation of their life together remained as solid as the mountains that had witnessed their beginning. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were grown and pursuing their own paths, Lillian and Garrett would sit on their porch and recall that fateful day when a broken wagon axle and a rainstorm brought them together. And always, they would marvel at how the moment that had seemed like misfortune had in fact been the greatest blessing of their lives, the first step on a journey neither could have imagined, but both would forever cherish as their own uniquely Western love story.